I arrived a little bit late. As you remember, this panel actually started with the presentation of a paper that was, as Ben Crum said, very much at the heart of the theme of this conference. Unfortunately, I have to tell you, it ends with a presentation of a paper which is very much at the fringes of the theme of this conference. So, in order to convince you that you all the same have perhaps some interest in staying along for my presentation, I want to link actually some of the things that were said in the previous presentations with what I'm actually going to try to show you in my presentation on the European Parliament. You probably remember on one of the slides by Alexia, there was this question, well, who's to blame actually for this economic mess in Greece? And this is obviously one of the rather important issues for, well, democracy in general. And I want to link that actually to Felix's presentation, which was kind of interesting that something like unemployment or growth and things like that, which I would say the European Parliament and the Commission have very little to do actually, that still voters seem to suddenly trust these institutions less. And this little comment I want to relate to something that Ben Crum actually had in the conclusion, saying probably what is required in getting out of this crisis is actually making decision-making much more transparent, that actually one knows who's to blame for particular things that happen in the context of the Euro crisis. I hope you're convinced. If not, you can leave now if you think that was just no good idea. Anyway, what I want to do is just very briefly give you a little bit more motivation for my paper, talk a little bit about voting in the European Parliament, and actually this very important issue, in my view, the transparency that actually is increasing in the European Parliament, talk about an empirical model which allows me to derive some, in my view, interesting features of what's happening in the European Parliament, talk about how parties actually influence the voting in the European Parliament and how that compares to the previous European Parliament, and once you have lived through all these different issues, talk actually in the conclusion and the discussion how that relates to the Euro crisis very briefly. Anyway, as you probably know, and that was my comment to Felix's presentation, obviously, formally, the European Parliament has very, very little to do with economic and monetary policy, and so is also very little involved, actually, in the Euro crisis. But on the other hand, one might argue that given what is probably required to get out of this crisis has also something to do a little bit with solidarity, actually, among different countries, and especially their citizens. It might actually be one of the organs where this solidarity might actually be fostered or created, and thus also affect the state of European democracy, and there I obviously stole something out of the title of this conference. Now, what is interesting actually, and that's why this paper refers to the Lisbon Treaty, there has been in the process of the ratification process of the Lisbon Treaty, there has been a small minor change in the rules of procedures of the European Parliament. In my view, this change of rule might actually affect quite considerably how the state of democracy in the European Union evolves. And I want to, at the end, discuss actually the effects of this change and discuss also how it played out in the issues related to the European crisis. Not European crisis, but Euro crisis. Anyway, that's probably all no news for you. The European Parliament basically employs 3 different ways in which they vote. Signal voting just by show of hands, so basically who's ever in the room can actually see whether your particular MEP votes the way you would like him to vote. There are also quite a few secret electronic votes, and then you have roll call votes where someone actually requests, or, as we will see, there are also a set of votes that are automatically roll call votes. Now, if you look actually at the rules of procedures, you see that the standard operating procedure is the signal vote, while the president may actually decide to hold an electronic vote, and a secret vote might actually also be requested by a certain number of the MEPs. Roll call votes, on the other hand, may be requested by a party group or a certain number of members of the European Parliament, in writing to be precise. And since, and that is the little rule change, interestingly enough, it was actually adopted already in EP6, but it applied only to EP7. Since 2009, all final passage votes I should have added in the legislative arena are automatically roll call votes. Why is this potentially important? Now, the way in which actually a parliament votes has a lot to do with transparency and accountability. I had already mentioned that if there's only a vote by show of hands, it's basically the people in the room that can actually check how a particular MEP has voted. On the other hand, if, for instance, on a final passage vote in a legislative matter, there's actually a roll call vote, then there is actually almost complete transparency, and you, as a voter having elected an MEP, might actually check how he has voted. Now, so far, until the end of EP6, roll call votes had to be requested, which raises a little bit the issue, well, why would a party group request, or a certain number of MEPs, why would they choose to ask for a roll call vote? Obviously, one might say, well, it's to make them vote in a more transparent way, but some co-authors actually worked on a theoretical model where we started from the presumption, and this is also discussed pretty heavily in the literature, that such roll call vote requests might actually also be used for disciplining purposes. So if as a party leader you're unsure whether your troops will follow you in a particular vote, and you know the outcome will be pretty close, then you might actually use these roll call votes in order to make sure that the MEPs actually follow your lead. There are other authors actually who argue it might also be signaling motivations, and we will come back to that a little bit later because one of my results pretty much shows that probably that is also an important motivation. It might be that some parties actually are very interested and very keen on making sure that the public, the newspapers, actually know that they supported a particular proposal. Just to give away my main punchline of the whole paper, that's not completely true, but the Greens are pretty famous for that. They basically often request roll call votes on particular issues where they want to show how they are very much in favor of particular legislation. Now, quite clearly, independent of what these motivations are, it's quite clear that having such votes will probably influence the way in which MPs, or MEPs, I should have written, behave. More specifically, it's for disciplining purposes. It kind of means that MEPs, if a roll call vote is requested by their party group leader, for instance, that they probably will vote differently compared to a situation where it would have been a secret vote. Similarly, probably also for signaling motivations. Now, as with the new parliament, EP7, actually, for a new set of votes, roll call vote information is available, you might actually try to assess how this rule change has affected how MEPs operate. There are actually two papers, one of them by a former graduate from the EUI, who have actually looked pretty much at the same data that I'm looking at. They come a little bit to different conclusions, but believe mine and you will be fine. No, I'm just exaggerating slightly. So on the one hand, there's been this study by Monica Mühlbock and Nicoletta Jordanova, who actually finds that, interestingly enough, in final passage votes, the party cohesion has become higher than in the sixth parliament. Hicks, Nouri, and Roland, actually, in their paper, they argue that there's nothing to be observed. Everything is the same in EP6 and EP7. Now, as I have already argued, if we have only signal voting, show of hands, we will only basically allow persons present in the parliament to observe what MEPs are doing. And on the other hand, in roll call votes, we actually have pretty strong transparency. You might actually expect that probably it's very difficult to compare these two sets of votes. However, what I argue, and that's what I do in this paper, is probably we can compare those two parliaments, those two sessions that I'm going to look at, in terms of the party pressure that parties actually exert on their members. A first thing that is interesting to look at is actually, and I look basically for both of these two parliaments, given that the 7th is still ongoing, at the first 18 months actually of the session. And what I report here is basically for all roll call votes on legislative matters, whether they're final passage votes or not. Just to remind you, in the 7th Parliament, and I think I can use this little thing, given that they are now required, this is the total final passage votes in the European Parliament. And as you see, actually, the share of those votes has increased, which is obviously kind of logical in the sense that all of them have now to be passed by roll call votes. And it was much lower actually in EP6. So quite clearly, comparing those two sets of votes, we have to take into consideration that the rules actually were different. Now, I'm going to be very, very quick actually with the empirical model that I use. It's basically a model that has gained quite some followers in the political science literature, which basically argues that an interesting way to look at roll call vote data is actually to rely on something that was basically developed in the school testing literature. So, strictly speaking, you could actually consider each vote in a parliament as a test question and test. And what you want to figure out is actually how smart you are. And you do not observe smartness, you only observe whether you have voted the right, answered the right or the wrong way. Now, you can actually translate this issue and basically say, well, it might be that, for instance, MEPs are more or less leftist or rightist, and as a function of whether they're more leftist or more rightist, they actually vote in a particular way. In addition to proposals, think again about test questions, they differ in terms of whether only the very smart people actually will get the right answer, or if only the very leftist people will actually vote in favor of this particular proposal. And in addition, also how discriminating these questions are. I could ask you a question, there are many political scientists in here and people from law faculties, could ask you a question which is completely unrelated to your knowledge about your discipline. This would not allow me to discriminate among you whether you belong to the smart people or not, but you're all smart people, so in any case, it wouldn't work. So what we are interested in is basically trying to figure out what the probability of a yes vote in a particular, on a particular decision is, and based on this, we would like to infer where the political parties, where the MEPs are actually located. But obviously, and that's definitely not news to you, this implies to some degree that the only thing that influences the votes of MEPs or any parliamentarian is their position on a particular policy dimension, or to go back to the schooling dimension, whether you are smart or whether you are a little bit less smart. But clearly in the context of voting in a parliament, as I said, there's disciplining purposes that why you might actually vote differently than what you actually feel like. You might want to signal something to your constituency which doesn't really correspond to what you believe on a particular issues. And so we might actually consider that the voting behavior is not only influenced by where you stand on a particular issue, but also to which party group you actually belong. And that's exactly the strategy that I use. And what I look at is actually how the effect of belonging to a particular party group, how it differs, starting with the European Parliament 7, how it differs actually between those roll call votes, the final passage votes, which are automatically roll call votes, and those where a party group actually requests a vote, roll call vote. If it's a disciplining story that explains why they request roll call votes, we should observe actually party pressure in these particular contexts. And here I illustrate actually graphically what these party pressures are. More specifically, to be precise, it's actually more the difference in terms of party pressures that you find between final passage votes, which are not requested roll call votes, on the other hand, those that are requested by a party group. And It's probably way too small. Hopefully you can still see it. For a few parties, it doesn't really matter. So for the Greens, basically, there's no difference whatsoever. For the Liberals either. However, for the two big parties, basically for the European People's Party and Social Democrats, there are quite important effects in party pressures. I should have been a little bit more precise. These curves actually show the distribution of the estimated effects, and if the curves are centered around zero, that basically means that you cannot distinguish these effects from no effect. On the other hand, when they are a little bit to the left or to the right from the zero, then that seems to suggest that there is actually some party pressure being exerted on the members of a particular party. I'm going to show you in a second the same thing for the European Parliament 6. And there, however, obviously, if I compare final passage votes to votes on amendments, for instance, both of these will be requested by particular party groups. And so the only thing that I can distinguish is votes on amendments compared to votes on the final passage of a particular directive or bill, basically. What one would expect if the two authors who have worked on the same data, that these votes can be easily compared, is that we should see no difference, actually. And I'm going to do that very quickly. I think that's the right, no, I don't have that. What you see, actually, if I just go back and forth, you see quite a few things moving. Strictly speaking, these scales are not comparable. But there's especially one thing, or two things that are actually interesting. It's the third graph, actually, in the top row. These are the Greens, basically. There's no effect, actually, in EP7. You move to EP6, suddenly they actually seem to discipline more strongly in requested roll call votes their party members than they did actually in EP7. Same thing for the graph down here. Basically, the leftists actually, where you also find a quite considerable shift. Now, what this basically means is that this rule change has actually affected how MEPs vote. Having a more transparent voting system for final passage votes actually leads to different behavior, and this obviously can be used in order to increase transparency. Now, just very quickly, given that I have mentioned the Greens, I'm going to skip this one. No, actually, that was the one I wanted to show you. I also looked actually at how the effects due to party pressure, how they vary according to who requests the roll call vote. And I look here actually at the Greens, and what is interesting here is, and that's what I had said before, when the Greens actually request the roll call vote, that doesn't affect at all their voting behavior. And this is basically because, well, they are so united anyway on a particular issue. They just want to demonstrate, look, we are all united behind protecting baby seals or something like that. I'm very neat. So anyway, but they're very united. It's also for some other parties, actually, the effects are rather minor. I'm going to skip this and move immediately to the discussion and conclusion. Now, what I think I can show in this paper is that this change in the rule of procedure actually might actually produce quite some tangible effects on how the European Parliament operates, and especially actually how it's visible towards citizens. And in my view, actually, this might actually also be related to how it's positioned in the context of EU-related matter. Sorry. I very briefly actually looked in the paper also how the European Parliament was involved in some measures dealing with the euro. And the interesting part is that for the period that I used for the analysis that I showed you, there were just very few decision processes that dealt with the euro that had actually roll call votes. Not surprisingly, and that's just one thing a little bit too much that I showed you, not surprisingly actually in 2011, 2012, that is these last couple of months, there were an increasing number of decisions that were related to it. Many of those basically resolutions from the European Parliament trying to force the other institutions actually to do something of the issues. But actually there were also much more roll call votes on final passage votes in this area, which seems to suggest that even in the area of the euro, when the European Parliament actually deals with that, they become actually more transparent due to this rule change. And this increased transparency, in my view, might very well actually affect the way in which EU citizens actually perceive the actions. And just to come back actually to Felix's presentation, I think if the citizens would actually understand what the European Union can do in the context of economic and monetary union, trust should not at all be affected by the economic conditions, in some sense, of the European Parliament, to take that as a precise condition. Anyway, just wrapping up, actually, quite clearly, with this rule change, transparency has certainly improved. I skip over something that probably the specialists of the European Parliament are well aware. This has also led to some changes in how the European Parliament actually operates, but I'm going to skip that and brush it under the rug. And what I was able to show is that the final passage votes in EP6 compared to those in EP7 are quite different, and that party effects actually depend on who requests these roll call votes. And that also suggests that if it's an automatic roll call vote, you might actually get a more, perhaps, truer reflection of what the MEPs and the party groups actually stand for. Whether these rule changes actually will also lead to increased transparency that will be used by citizens, that's obviously a completely different question, in the sense that, to come back actually to Alexia's question, if the European Parliament actually does a few things that citizens do not appreciate, and they know that, the citizens know that it's the European Parliament's fault, will the citizens actually take this into account when they are called to vote for their new members of the European Parliament? Thank you.